So I wanted to continue looking at Understanding the System, Part 2 on dependent arising. So in the last talk, we looked at how our mind naturally feels and believes that things exist. And when we come to the understanding that things exist, we do that by distinguishing things from everything else that is not that thing. So as I mentioned, this glass of water, I understand this glass of water in my mind by distinguishing it from everything that is not the glass of water. So it's not my hand, it's not the space around it. The water itself is not the glass is not the water. We make these distinctions. But the problem is, when we think like that, we are not seeing dependent relationship. We are seeing this thing in isolation, as if the thing does not depend upon anything else. But the reality is that everything comes from things that are not that thing, and that without things that are not the self, that thing would not exist. This is very profound and subtle, but it deals with how the mind holds things to exist. And all of our ignorance is like this. We literally are ignoring all of the causes that make up our world, ourselves, and so forth. And so our gaining wisdom, overcoming ignorance, involves seeing this dependent relationship and recognizing that things would not exist if it were not for that which was not the thing. And in particular, we would not exist if it was not for others, for example. And in particular, our parents were primary cause. Others are here as well, but we might have many teachers, so we're dependent upon our teachers, our parents, society, etc., etc., etc. All of these are causes that flow into the self, and the self is directly or indirectly a byproduct of the world in which we live. Now, of course, the self has some degree of independence, but then independence is relative. And this self at some point will go out of existence. It seems to exist right now, but it will go out of existence. And this is what fills us with this existential fear, because we don't want to die. Check. I think you'll find we don't want to die. Obviously, normally, when things are going all right in our life, in our world, we are strongly inclined towards self-preservation. But let's look at that. Let's look at that dependent relationship. So in part 1 of this talk, we introduced these 4 truths, right? All of our sufferings and problems and where they come from, their origins. And how to attain freedom, and what is the path to attain freedom. So we're going to look at the exact same topic now, but from the lens of dependent relationship. So we gave a general introduction to how this works. So for example, all of our inner problems and sufferings, I said, came from these origins. And these various inner problems, including death and our fear of death, aging, sickness, birth, and all of these other kinds of sufferings, they all have their roots here in these origins. And I want to explain that dependent relationship and what that means. So in particular, within these, let's start with death. There is the saying, right? Nothing is certain but death, except death and taxes. So death is a very unpopular subject. We tend to avoid this in conversation. We tend to avoid thinking about it. We fear it, and we try to avoid and become free from death, in any way we can, including by ignoring it and pretending it and thinking and acting as if it will never happen to us, that we're not actually vulnerable to death. Now, despite avoiding it, nevertheless, it hangs over us like a shadow. This fear of death is always with us. Now, if we did not fear death, what else would there be to be afraid of, right? If nothing could kill you, in a sense, you're almost fearless, right? But the reality is that we have all of these social anxiety and so forth. Fundamentally, these fears that we encounter in our life, a lot of them they're rooted in a survival anxiety. Why do we want to be accepted by a group? Because if you're an outcast, you are at risk of death, right? That's a fundamental risk we have in life. If somebody threatens you, like someone in a position of power challenges you, right? It triggers a visceral feeling in your heart, in your belly, of fear. That is the same reaction you would have if you saw a snake, right? If you almost died. It is a fear of death that's always hanging over us and haunting us. So if we want to become free from that fear of death, that suffering of death, what is the method to become free from that fear and from all fears? We'll look at this now from the lens of dependent relationships. So we ask ourselves, where does death come from? And we can say aging and death. Let's throw those in there. Where does death come from? Well, there are two causes of death. There is the immediate circumstantial cause of death. Could be an illness, could be an accident, could be whatever, old age, as we say. But there is another root cause of death, which is birth. Death is a dependent related phenomenon. Without birth, there is no death, right? Remembering our sprout here, without the seed, there is no sprout. Here we are, seeds and sprouts. Without the seed, there is no sprout. And without birth as the seed, there is no death. There is no aging and death. And so bear with me here, because I know this sounds unusual. If you want to be free from aging and death, the solution is very simple. Be free from birth. Now, interestingly, this kind of way of thinking can even come up for us philosophically. I've heard from a teenager recently who was saying to his mother, why did you even have me, right? The world is a terrible place. I wish I was never born, right? And so sometimes mentally, emotionally, we can get to this space where we wish we'd never been born. And in a sense, we're recognizing that all of the sufferings and all of the problems that we have in our life, they are all rooted in birth. Again, bear with me here. This may seem, I don't know how it seems, is a challenging but very profound topic. They say that birth, if you build a fire in a fireplace in a house, and the fire warms the entire house, all of the heat in that house comes from the fire. In the same way, all of the suffering in our life, whatever aging, sickness, death, disappointment, all of these other kinds of frustrations, failing to satisfy our desires and so forth, all of these kinds of sufferings, they all come back to birth. Now, what is birth dependent on? And this is an interesting question, of course, because here we get a fork in the road, a little bit of a fork in the road, because you might have people who believe in past and future lives or something like that, and maybe they would posit that there is something before birth, like maybe some version of us, prior version of us before birth. Now, this is a little bit speculative, of course, because it is outside the realm of what we can see. So, if I so we can say that there is a realm of direct experience. And so direct experience is, somewhat limited. This is, we can see in this realm, this world, birth and death and these kinds of things. All of these are visible. But anything outside of that is more, speculative. Could there be something before birth? Could death and so forth be just the beginning? Is there something after death? Well, a lot of theories out there. I'm not qualified to speak about them because my direct experience is just in this domain, right? And so this is an interesting fork in the road where basically you might have religious people talking about something before birth or after death, and so forth. Non-religious people denying that there's anything before birth or after death. But the system is a very, very profound, right? Because there's something else going on here. There is something else quite profound that is happening here, which is that there is this idea of existence, that something exists, and so existence means, it's what we were talking about just earlier, that there is a sense that there is a thing, for example, that exists, like this I or self. We believe that this I or self exists, and we believe that it's separate from all of these other things, these other causes. And so similarly, we believe that there is a self that exists and is traveling along this continuum from birth through to death. And that is our natural belief, our natural view. And in a sense, that self is available to direct experience. We feel ourself, we know ourself, others, we know others, and so forth. And so there's a strong sense that there's a self that exists, that's traveling between birth and death, and so forth. And it is this existence of the self that is actually the cause of both birth and aging and death. There is a sense that we have that we came into existence, and with that belief in the self coming into existence, we say, I was born, and I grew old, and I died, and I did this, and this happened to me, and so forth. So we're continuously dealing with this concept of self. Now, when we hold that concept of self, we're not actually thinking of it as a dependent related self. We're thinking of it as something that just exists independently. We feel like I feel like I am independently navigating the world and interacting with you and bumping into people and so forth. And the self there is a sense in which we're holding there to be a permanent thing, a thing that is created, exists for a while, and then ceases. And now that is related to what's known as permanent grasping. And so I mentioned back in this section earlier on origins and delusions and so forth, that this ignorance of permanent grasping is at the root of the way we think normally and the root of our suffering. So what is permanent grasping? think of this self. When we look at the self with permanent grasping, how does it look? So the way permanent grasping works is we feel like things have a continuity, they have an existence over time. And there are two kinds of, let's see, when we think of there is a strong tendency to think of things in the sense it was created, it exists for a period of time, and then it ceases. And when we're doing that, when we're thinking in that way, we're actually holding to there being a permanence, a kind of existence that is persisting over time. Something has a persistence over time. That is not an accurate view of anything. We used previously the analogy of a river, saying that the self, like Kathy, is like a river. Now, a river is constantly flowing. As the saying goes, you never step into the same river twice. This person is constantly flowing and changing. So if we really recognize the impermanence of things, there is, whereas normally we have some sense that there is something is created in the beginning, and then comes into existence, and then it goes, it ceases, it goes out of existence, and then in between, we believe that there is, shall we say, an existence, that something exists in between these two stages, that there is a kind of lastingness to things, that they persist over time. But the reality is that nothing persists, even for a moment. That things are produced, and in the very next moment, they cease. So if you take the sprout, for example, they're changing constantly. Now, this is maybe over the course of a couple of days, these sprouts appearing. Now, if they're changing like this over the course of a couple of days, then of course they're changing every hour a little bit, although maybe imperceptibly. And if they're changing every hour, then they're changing every minute, although perhaps imperceptibly. And if they're changing every minute, then they're changing every second, although perhaps imperceptibly. And I think we're intelligent enough, and certainly science would back us up on this, to say that actually on a cellular level, there's not one moment in which the cells are still. And on an atomic level, there's not one moment at which the atoms are still. And on a subatomic level, there's not even any atoms, right? It's just a bunch of energy and motion and so forth. So at every level, at every scale, there is constant change, constant flux, like a river, which means there is no real beginning or end to these things, any more than there is a beginning or end to a river. If we look at this picture of a river, we say, where does the ocean begin and the river end? Well, you can make a distinction, but you're just making it up. You're just drawing a line with your mind. And for example, all of these little rivulets, are those rivulets actually part of the river or not? These wetlands here, are they part of the same river or are they not? Well, you can make these distinctions, some barrier here, a road perhaps. Are these different bodies of water down here and over here? Clearly the mind is making these things up, making these distinctions. So coming back to the example of existence, there is no permanence, there is no lasting, there is no moment at which something is abiding. And although we think that there was a moment of birth, when, for example, the father's sperm, mother's egg came together and so forth, those two things had a prior existence as part of our parents' bodies. They joined, and then they're beginning to mature and grow and so forth. And even before, long before we come out of the womb, there's constant growth, constant changing. These moving germ cells become a moving zygote, this fertilized egg, becoming a whatever blastocyst, all these stages of embryonic development, becoming an embryo, becoming a baby, eventually fetus and baby, and so forth. At no point in this process was there any stillness. The body's never been still. The mind has never been still as well. For whatever there was that had a mind at any point, the mind's always moving. You can't have a mind that's not moving. It's just violates by definition, because the mind is produced from impermanent causes. Minds are always in motion. So this is quite profound, right? To say that it is only because we have a sense that we have come into existence, a sense that we were born, that birth exists. Only because there is a sense of permanence of the self, existence, that birth exists, and only because of birth that aging and death exists. And so all of our fears of aging and death, they're actually rooted in this sense of existence of the self, the sense that there is a permanent self that can that came into existence, eventually will go out of existence. Our mind's already abiding in these extremes, this extreme, oh, I exist, I don't want to not exist. And so we each have a personal lived experience. It's a little bit like the extremes between the religious world that postulates something before birth and after death, that is kind of holding to a permanence, and the secular world that would deny anything before birth or after death, and extreme of non-existence. Both of those are extremes. The extreme of existence, that there's this continuity across lives, is one extreme of existence. The extreme of non-existence, that there's nothing before or after this life, is another extreme, the extreme of non-existence. And both of those are extremes because neither of them recognize that the self, the existence of the self, is a concept. Okay, so this is very profound, and it'll be worth taking a break, but we'll regroup with the next episode and look more at how this comes to pass.